For my book project, I chose On Your Mark, Challenging the Conventions of Grading and Reporting, written in 2015 by Thomas R. Guskey, Professor of Educational Psychology in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. The objective of the text, and therefore the objective of this presentation, is to challenge the status quo of grading policies and procedures, both mathematically and philosophically. We learned in Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that a mission statement is integral to life. If you don't have a mission, if you don't have a purpose, what are you doing? Well, Guskey argues the same goes for grading, that every teacher should have a purpose statement, an explanation of policies and procedures, and that purpose statement should be transparent. Guskey even goes as far as to say that it should be posted on every report card because, quote, method follows purpose. He also makes the distinction between assessment grades and standards-based grades. We should all aim for standards-based grades as those outline clear skills. This is what the student needs to do in order to pass the class. These are the skills, so standards-based grades are important. It's also important to consider the audience. To whom will the grades be reported? Parents and guardians, students, both? At the elementary level, it's clearly the parents, but at the middle and high school level, the waters get a bit muddy. Is it both? And knowing who you're talking to will help clear up communication. Now, I don't know about you, but I spend most of my conference time explaining to parents, what does this grade mean? What grades are still coming? What does my son or daughter need to get his or her grade up? And if all of that communication was done proactively versus reactively, we could spend less time at conferences decoding, and as William Ayers discusses in To Teach, we can use that conference time to connect with families and use them as valuable resources. Learn about the student, learn about his or her likes or dislikes, what's going on at home, and spend less time talking about the grade. Now, believe it or not, grade reporting was pretty much unknown until the 1850s, and it wasn't until the 1980s that percentage grading became the norm. Now, why is that? Well, because it's easy. But as Guskey states, despite their popularity, percentage grades are the most difficult to justify or defend from a procedural, practical, or ethical perspective. Now, why is that? Well, it all comes down to levels of failure versus success. If you look at the visual there, you see with a typical letter grading scale, the passing to failure ratio is much more in the student's favor. They have a greater chance of passing. Whereas in the percentage grading scale, you see the likelihood of failure outweighs that of passing. Now, not that we want to push all of our students through without rigor, but the end goal is for students to be successful. We want that in the end. Now, instead of having percentage grading, Guskey suggests integer grading, which is a 0 to 4 scale, which is where we get our 4.0 GPA scale. So not only would it make it easier in translating grade point average, but it gives a more straightforward and accurate measure of student learning. So the scale is below, basic, proficient, and advanced. We also have problems with plus or minus grades because the more variances you have within a grading system, so instead of having the 5 categories each letter, when you add the plus or minuses, you end up having 12 different components on the grading scale, and the more components you have, the greater likelihood of inaccuracies. Now let's take a look at integer grading in action. The grading matrix that you will see on the screen, you'll see on the left true scores, which reflect what students actually learned, and observed scores, which reflect what students obtained on an assessment that will impact their grade. So often we know that what a student gets on a test doesn't always reflect their knowledge, and so you'll see the light gray is kind of that margin of error. On a 0 to 4 scale, 20 of the 25 cells are the misclassification. So the 5 dark ones are accurate grading, which, is not the best odds. But if you increase the matrix, outside of the 4 scales, and you've got the 12 category scale, that's all the letter grades with pluses and minuses, cutoffs, you get 144 cells, 132 of which represent incorrect classifications. So mathematically speaking, the more variances you have in letter grades, the more numbers there are, the more complicated it is, the greater the margin of error. Guskey also goes on to discuss bell curve and class rank, both of which he admonishes, saying, doing well does not mean learning excellently. It means outdoing your classmates. Both practices encourage competition more than collaboration. Now, in Gallup's Teach with Your Strengths, we were encouraged to focus on our strengths, on our growth, more than our weakness. And that's what Guskey says we should do with grading. So often, we average students' grade. This is how you did on average over the course of a term. But wouldn't you expect students to grow and have greater gains toward the end? So why should those formative components have so much weight? Also, what if a student has a family emergency 1 week? Should that emergency have so much weight on that student's grade? Now, if you look on the screen, you'll see 7 scenarios, each of which has unique circumstances throughout the term. And when you average them, you don't consider that unique human variable. Guskey offers 3 alternatives to averaging by first, giving priority to the most recent evidence, second, give priority to the most comprehensive evidence, and third, giving priority to evidence related to the most important learning goals or standards. Lastly, Guskey brings about some questionable grading practices, saying to combine such behavioral evidence in a grade that is supposed to reflect learning distorts the entire grading process and makes effective communication impossible. Some examples of questionable grading practices are behaviors, punishments, and using grades as rewards. Grades should reflect learning, that's it. So bringing in a box of Kleenex or showing up on time or having a pencil is not actually a skill needed in that class. Those are behaviors, punishments, and rewards, and as Guskey says, they should be avoided at all costs.